This video is going to be more of a half history lesson, half rant kind of a deal going on today. There are people in this world who believe that the King James Version of the Bible is the only valid translation of the Bible in English. These people hold so tightly to the King James Version that they assert that all modern translations are heretical and the work of some satanic conspiracy to turn people away from the worship of the one true God. And if you don't believe me, look it up. These people actually believe this. Fortunately, people like that are relatively few in the body of believers. And despite their caustic attitudes toward their fellow Christians, I just want to throw this out there that we need to continue to love them regardless. But I do know a few people who are not quite that extreme, but do believe that the King James Version is somehow superior to other translations for whatever reason, and they often like to take shots at new translations. The NIV is a personal favorite among these people who talk like this. One man I know, and hopefully he's watching this, like to call the NIV the nearly inspired version, which maybe it's funny, maybe it's not. But I have three people in mind who are kind of along these lines. I know their names, I know their faces, and these are the people that are in my mind as I make this video right now. And this is made primarily for them. However, I do intend for this to be educational for anybody who's watching. Now first I want to make clear that I'm not trying to cause any kind of confusion, and that I need to state that although there are many different translations of the Bible, they do not present a different message in each one. The Bible is translated many different ways for many different styles of reading, and really it all just comes down to a matter of personal preference. As long as the message, the true message of the gospel and the Bible remains intact, then you're reading a good translation. I've told some people this, that there's a big difference between changing your message and changing your presentation. You can change your presentation all the time. Presentation should be constantly changing to fit who you're talking to, or the situation you're in. But that doesn't mean the message has to change, and that's the way I see Bible translations. Is that it's just changing the presentation but keeping the message intact. If you grew up with the King James Version of the Bible and you like it, it's your favorite version, great. I have a King James Version of the Bible myself. I like to read it from time to time. It's kind of cool to read the very poetic type of language that exists in that Bible, and I certainly would never deny its contribution, and it's the foundation it laid for all English translations that are in existence today. But if you open up a King James Bible and you're like, what the heck is this? This is like Shakespeare, and you can't understand it, then that's fine. Don't worry. There's plenty of great translations available out there that you can read, like the New King James Version, which is basically just the King James Version with updated language to make it more modern sounding. There's also the NIV, as I mentioned earlier. I think it's the most popular Bible translation available today. There's also the New American Standard Version, which is it's a very literal translation, but it's also it's well regarded. And also the English Standard Version, which is also quite literal, but from what I understand, a bit more readable than the New American Standard. But again, look around. You know, if you like a certain version, use it. You know, it doesn't matter. As long as the message is intact, you've got a good translation. My issue arises when I hear people say that the King James is somehow superior to all Bible translations, and I'm here to refute that claim. Now, a little bit of history. The King James Version of the Bible was first known as the Authorized Version because it was authorized by the King of England to be used by the common man at the time. It was first published in 1611, and that means that this particular translation, in some form or another, has been in existence for 400 years. And that's my first point of contention with people who claim the superiority of the King James. When the Bible's translated into a new language, it's translated into the common vernacular of the language, the common language of the people. That was actually the intended purpose of the King James Version when it was originally printed. Up until that time, the dominant translation of the Bible was Latin. Priests would read the Bible in Latin, and it would you basically have to know Latin in order to read the Bible. And so the common man, basically relied on a priest to tell him what the Bible said, and that led to all kinds of corruptions. People either unintentionally mistranslating things, or guys just coming up with stuff to tell people what to do as means of controlling people. And so when the King James Version was authorized by King James I, it was made with the intention of giving the common man a Bible that could be read and understood in his own language. And language is something that's constantly changing. It's not static. Language, in 400 years, the English language has changed significantly. If you were to go back and look at the actual 1611 edition of the King James Version, it would be nearly unreadable because they used different letters. They used, even if they did use some of the same letters, they were kind of ordered differently. It was not the English that we know today. It was a very somewhat primitive form of modern English. And actually, the edition that most people use of the King James Version today was the 1769 edition that came about after several revisions of the original 1611 text, which consequently, by the way, had several errors in it, like misspellings or what have you. Even still, even after all the revisions and corrections and things that, you've got words like thee, thou, wouldst, shall, wilt, and, the like, those Shakespearean type words that are long since past their use in the English language. And those are just the words that most people can kind of understand today, but you add in words like blains, cruise, C-R-U-S-E, not like boat cruise, husbandman, wot, W-O-T, and visage. And you have a translation that's very difficult to understand by the standards of modern English language. My second point of contention to the claim that the King James is superior is the fact that the New Testament of the King James Version was translated using a manuscript known as the Textus Receptus. And I'm not going to sit here and claim that the King James is an inadequate translation, because it's not. It's just as good as any other. But I will say that scholars have found that the Textus Receptus is a fairly inaccurate copy of the original text. It was completed by a man known as Erasmus, who was using what's known as the Byzantine texts. And of the over 5,000 manuscripts that were available in that text, he used no more than 6 in his translation, or in his creation of this Textus Receptus. And the earliest manuscripts that he had access to were from the like 1000, which was just like about 500 years before he came up with his thing. Now, for comparison, more modern translations use the Westcott and Hort compilation of the New Testament, which came about from manuscripts that date back to as far as the 2nd, 3rd centuries, which is, 800 years earlier. And most scholars would contend that the earlier manuscripts, which were closer, less removed from the original autographs, would naturally be more accurate. And so that's why the modern translations use those older ones as opposed to the ones that the King James used. And without going into any more detail about that, that's the difference between the two different textual bases for modern versus King James. Anyway, back to Erasmus. He finished the Textus Receptus in the early 1500s, which, by the way, was just about 100 years before the King James was created. It's also of note that scholars have found that Erasmus took the margin notes that were in these texts that he used, and he added them somehow into the actual biblical text, which is why if you compare a modern translation to the King James, you may find, or it may appear, that some sentences or even verses are missing. And King James only advocates would say that, oh, see, that's proof that these modern translations are removing things from the Bible. They're taking things out of the Bible and perverting the Bible. But that's simply not the case. These people who translate these modern translations are God-fearing people who simply want to get the Bible to people in the most readable way possible. And the reason that those verses or sentences are not in most modern translations is because the manuscripts that they use, which, again, most scholarly research would claim that the manuscripts used by modern translations are more reliable than the one used by the King James, is because those verses, or more accurately, those sentences, were not in those original manuscripts, in the original Greek. And so, therefore, they are not included. But because verse numbers weren't introduced to the Bible until the 1500s, and the King James Version was obviously translated after that, you get the verse numbers that we have. And so instead of renumbering the verses to make it right, in order to avoid confusion, they just remove that verse number. And so to some people, they'll look at that and it'll look like a verse has been removed, but it really hasn't. It actually has been added in the manuscript that was used to translate the King James Version. I should also point out that there are a few modern translations that use the Textus Receptus as their textual basis, most notably being the New King James Version, which, as I said, is simply just a modern rewording of the King James Version with, honestly, minimal rewording. just basically taking the outdated words and making them newer. Also, the recently released Modern English version, which was released earlier this year, it also uses the Textus Receptus as the basis for its translation. And now this is something, this is kind of a side rant here. This is something that really irks me about King James only people, because a lot of them will claim that the King James Version is superior because of its textual basis, because the Textus Receptus is somehow inspired, you know, more so than any other, you know, whatever. But when you show them a modern translation that uses the Textus Receptus for its textual basis, they reject it still, because they claim that it's just as heretical and conspiratorial, or whatever they want to call it, as other modern translations, which tells me that their loyalty is not to the original text, the original autographs, or the original manuscripts, but their loyalty is simply to the King James Version of the English Bible, and that's it, which is fallacy at best and really dangerous at worst. Now, here's the point in this video here that I'm gonna compare some translations. This is actually from a website that I found where a man he's answering the claims of a King James only advocate. He claims that the NIV is a perversion, which he's such a clever man that he came up with the idea to call it the New International Perversion. He's so clever. Anyway, what he writes, what this man on this website refutes this other man's claims is very interesting, and I'm going to read basically just this page that he wrote about this. Now, I'm going to read what the King James only advocate wrote in the way that I think that he would have sounded when he was writing, or if he was saying it out loud, because the way he writes in all caps and uses lots of exclamation points. And so I'm gonna read it the way that it seems like it should be read, and then I'll read this other man's response. Now, the first claim by this King James only advocate comes from 1 Timothy 3:16. He claims, and I'm just reading this right now, it says 1 Timothy 3:16, the clearest verse in the Bible proclaiming that Jesus Christ was God. The King James Bible reads, and without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in the flesh. The King James says plainly, God was manifest in the flesh. The NIV reads, He appeared in a body. The NIV twists God. He appeared in a body? So what? Everyone has appeared in a body. He is a pronoun that refers to a noun or antecedent. There is no antecedent in the context. That statement does not make sense. The NIV subtly, see Genesis 3:1, perverts 1 Timothy 3:16 into utter nonsense. Now here's 1 Timothy 3:16, directly translated from Greek. That portion of 1 Timothy 3:16. And confessedly great is the mystery of piety, who was manifested in flesh, ... and it continues. The Greek word hos is the word who or which. It is not correctly translated as God. The NIV's choice of he is closer to who in the Greek than the King James Version's choice of God. But even if the reader does not make the connection, there is a footnote reference for the word that reads some manuscripts, God. So the NIV even points out that other versions, such as King James, read God, even though it is not in the original Greek. Furthermore, verse 15, the verse just previous to verse 16, reads this way, If I am delayed, you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of the truth. 1 Timothy 3:15. Clearly, Paul was talking about God. Most people who read verse 16 in the NIV and wonder whom he is automatically would back up one verse to see whom Paul is calling he, and see clearly in verse 15 that it is God. In doing so, readers also would be gaining more information and knowledge about God and his household, the church. The critic of the NIV has removed verse 16 from the framework and context of the whole passage, isolated it, judged it by his austere standards, and attempted to slaughter it. Yet the verse remains alive and well for anyone who is perceptive and wise enough to read the entire written section within which it is contained. It should be pointed out that there are New Testament passages indicating that Jesus is God in the original Greek, for which the NIV provides a better rendering than the King James. One example is John 1:18, along with which I will include verse 17. And this is a direct translation from the Greek. Because the law through Moses was given, the grace and the truth through Jesus Christ became God no man has seen ever. The only begotten God, the one being in the bosom of the Father, that one declared him. Here's how the King James Version and the NIV respectively translate verse 18. Here's the King James. No man hath seen God at any time, the only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him. And here's the NIV. No one has ever seen God, but God the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. From verse 17, it is clear that the person about whom the passage is speaking is Jesus Christ. In verse 18, the Greek shows that it is the only begotten God who declares the Father. So the original Greek text specifies that Jesus, who is God, is the one who does this. Likewise, the NIV, referring to Jesus, says that God, the one and only, is the one who makes the Father known. On the other hand, the King James Version indicates that it is the only begotten Son, not the only begotten God, who declares the Father. A reader might infer that Jesus, the Son, is God, but the King James Version does not say so explicitly. The NIV teaches, in this case, as well as in abundant other places, that Jesus, without question, was God manifested in flesh. In reading the NIV, there should be no question that he was and is God. Now, second complaint that this King James only man had. Luke 2:33. The King James Bible reads, And Joseph and his mother marveled at those things which were spoken of him. The NIV reads, The child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him. The child's father? Was Joseph Jesus' father? Not if you believe the virgin birth. Not if you believe John 3:16 that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. A subtle perversion of the virgin birth. Here's Luke 2:33 in the Greek. Direct translation from Greek. And was the father of him and the mother marveling at the things being said concerning him. That's from the Greek. A direct translation from the Greek. Again, the NIV's translation, child's father, is a more correct translation of the Greek than the King James translation. Joseph. There is not some conspiracy by whoever wrote the NIV, nor by the Catholic Church, in wanting to mislead people into thinking that Joseph was Jesus' biological father. By the way, one of the complaints that this King James only guy had was that the NIV was made by people who wanting to was written by Catholics or something like that. He was complaining about Catholics. But But it says, this guy comes back and says, if anyone believes in Jesus' virgin birth by Mary, whom they exalt very highly, it is the Catholic Church. The King James Version is correct in identifying Joseph as being the person to whom that verse refers. However, it is incorrect in its exact translation from the Greek. Interestingly, all but the King James and New King James omit the word Joseph in Luke 2:33, and that is because Joseph is not in the original Greek. Even in the New King James, there is a notation that reads, and his father and mother. So, as far as I have seen, the King James Version is alone in using the word Joseph in that verse, and in not explaining to the reader that in the Greek from which it was translated, the word is not there. Notice these other verses in Luke chapter 2 of the King James. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. That's Luke 2:41. And when they saw him, they were amazed. And his father said unto him, Son, why hast thou thus dealt with us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing. That's Luke 2:48 in the King James. In the first case, it is implied that Joseph was one of Jesus' parents. In the second case, even Mary implies to Jesus that Joseph is his father. So for those who argue that the King James always and invariably indicates that Jesus is the son of only God the Father and not the son of Joseph, these appear to be at least two exceptions in the King James itself. For someone learning about Jesus for the first time and reading the King James Version, both of these verses all by themselves would seem to imply that Jesus was the son of Joseph rather than the son of God. Of course, believers understand that Jesus was not the biological son of Joseph. But new readers might get the wrong impression from the King James Version in these particular cases. Also, for someone reading the first 3 chapters of Luke in any version of the Bible and translated from any Greek text, it should be crystal clear that the text states that Jesus was born of a virgin and was the Son of God. Due to all of this, I find it irrelevant and immaterial for anyone to focus on Luke 2:33, nitpicking and splitting hairs about the fact that the King James is unique in not implying that Joseph was Jesus' biological father, and attempting to discredit other versions which, in their opinion, insinuate that he was. Third argument, Colossians 1:14. The King James Bible reads, in whom we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sins. The NIV reads, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. The NIV rips out the precious words, through his blood. Friend, redemption is only through his blood. Hebrews 9:22 reads, without shedding of blood is no remission. The old song says, what can wash away my sins? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Direct translation from the Greek, Colossians 1:14. In whom we have the redemption, comma, the forgiveness of the sins, period. In the original Greek, the phrase through his blood is not there. Some versions, such as the King James, have added it, probably taking it from Ephesians 1:7. The NIV even includes a footnote reference here that reads, a few late manuscripts, redemption through his blood. Thus, the King James Version adds something to the original Word of God. Even if what it adds is a true statement, it is better to let the Word of God speak for itself, and not add nor take anything away from it. The NIV, on the other hand, translates the original text more accurately. Furthermore, with the footnote reference, it certainly does not abandon the principle that redemption is obtained only through the blood of Jesus, which is absolutely true. Fourth argument. The NIV perverts Mark 1, 2, and 3 into a lie. The NIV reads, It is written in Isaiah the prophet, I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way, a voice of one calling in the desert. Prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. It is not written in Isaiah. I will send my messenger ahead of you, I will prepare your way, is found in Malachi 3:1. The King James correctly reads, as it is written in the prophets. A better translation, easier to read. By a lie! Direct translation of Mark 1, 2, and 3 from the Greek. Direct translation. As it has been written in Isaiah the prophet, Behold, I send the messenger of me before the face of you, who will prepare the way of you. Period. In advocating the correctness of the King James Version, the claim is that the reference to the prophet Isaiah should not be there. This is absolutely false. In the Greek above, the fifth word in Mark 1:2 is translated Isaiah. If the word Isaiah actually is in Mark 1:2 in the Greek text, then it is incorrect to remove it, as the King James does. In the NIV, a footnote reference after Mark 1:2 points to Malachi 3:1, and a footnote reference after Mark 1:3 points to Isaiah 43. Those are the two prophets, Malachi and Isaiah, to which the King James refers when it reads, as it is written in the prophets. However, the King James Version fails to make this connection, whereas the NIV is clear about the connection. These are just a few of the arguments that were brought against modern translations, specifically the NIV. And really, most modern translations translate it pretty much the same as the NIV. The pertinent words are the same, generally speaking, in all the newer translations, because they all come from the same textual basis, and the King James doesn't. So I've made my case. I think I've made my case, and it's up to you to determine if you think it has merit or not. As I said at the beginning of this video, regardless of which version you choose or prefer, it doesn't matter, as long as it truly doesn't alter the doctrines of faith in the Bible. And there are a few so-called Bible versions that do that. I won't deny that, but they are relatively few, and that's a video for another time. So yeah, I leave you with that. Hope it gives you something to think about as you read the Bible.